specifically February 28th, I came to the Senate to visit with my colleagues about the more than 2,000 tax provisions that expired at the end of 2017. That same day, I joined with Finance Committee Ranking Member Wyden of Oregon to introduce a bill entitled Tax Extender and Disaster Relief Act of 2019 to extend these 24 tax provisions through 2019. And I very much thank Ranking Member Wyden for his cooperation on this effort. Actually, we have a lot of cooperation on a lot of different subjects within the Finance Committee. Now, unfortunately, we're still waiting on House Democrats to send us a tax bill that includes those provisions so that taxpayers who have relied on an extension can finish their 2018 tax returns. I've had some discussions with the chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and I don't have any reason to believe that he doesn't believe some of these extenders should be extended. But I suppose because they're new to running the House of Representatives and they have a dissension within their own caucus, it takes a while to get a active group of people pushing for this particular legislation. But it ought to be easy to happen because these tax provisions have traditionally been extended every 2 or 3 years over the last 20 years, maybe longer than that in some cases. I remind my colleagues in the House of Representatives that taxpayers have all but run out of time. Part of my purpose in introducing the Tax Extender and Disaster Relief Act way back in February was to provide additional certainty for the current year for those businesses that have made use of these tax credits in the past. I noted that in most cases, Congress enacted those provisions to provide an incentive for taxpayers to engage in certain actions like investment and job creation. In February, I also reminded my colleagues that those incentives are most effective when taxpayers can rely on them during the tax year. And for the most part, over the last couple, 3 decades, they've had that certainty by the renewal of them, of these tax credits. Regrettably, we're now a third of the way through 2019 with no certainty for affected taxpayers in sight. I also said in my February remarks that my broader objective of including an extension through 2019 was so that we could have some maneuvering room to examine the temporary provisions overall and try to identify longer-term solutions. Through efforts in the last Congress, we've identified potential long-term solutions for 2 of them, the short line railroad tax credit and the biodiesel tax credit. But we have the opportunity now to do still more. While we continue to try to help taxpayers who still need to resolve their 2018 tax returns, we need to press ahead on more permanent solutions so we can end Congress's continual bad habit of waiting until the 11th hour or months after to extend temporary tax policy. Accordingly, today, I'm announcing, along with Ranking Member Wyden, that the Finance Committee will form several bipartisan task forces to examine the temporary tax policies. These task forces will consist of members of the Finance Committee and focus on provisions that expired or will expire between December 31st, 2017 and December 31st of this year. That's a total of 42 expiring tax provisions. Each task force will be charged with examining temporary tax policies within one of 5 identified issue areas. These issue areas are workforce and community development, health taxes, energy, business cost recovery, and a combined group consisting of individual excise taxes and other temporary policies. We'll ask the task forces to work with the stakeholders and also with other Senate committees, other Senate offices, and interested parties to consider the original purpose of the policy, and then to ask the question whether the need for the provisions still continue today. If so, we'll ask the task force to identify possible solutions that would provide long-term certainty in these areas. That may mean that the credit or deduction phases out over a period of years to provide an effective industry a glide path to self-sufficiency. In other cases, it may mean that the provisions could be scaled back while still providing sufficient benefit for the affected industry or taxpayers in exchange for long-term certainty. If there's little or no case for continuing the temporary policy, the task force should consider whether the provision should be eliminated. There may also be provisions that the task force identifies that should be extended without reform. For these provisions, the task force will have to consider whether a continued short-term extension is sufficient to achieve the policy goals, whether a longer-term extension is desirable to force a future Congress to reevaluate the provision down the road, or if permanency is warranted. This is particularly relevant for the temporary tax policies relating to health care. For these, we'll ask the task force to focus on whether the tax policy should be extended and for what duration. And of course, we'll leave the evaluation of the underlying health care policy to health experts. In all, the task forces will work to identify reform proposals like those identified for the short line railroad tax credit and the biodiesel tax credit last year, so that we can then end the policy of Congress always kicking the can down the road each time, which happens to be 1, 2, or 3 years. Or in the light of our current predicament, the even worse policy of doing the kicking months after the year has ended, as is the case in 2019. If Congress is going to use temporary tax policy, taxpayers should be able to count on it for an intended period. Moreover, the intended policy should be clear so that taxpayers do not fall into the trap of relying on a provision simply because Congress has created the expectation that the provision will be consistently extended even well after the fact. Taxpayers relying on these provisions have been doing what Congress wanted them to do, and that happens to be the free market, investing in certain types of property, or hiring new employees, or taking other types of action. We shouldn't punish them for doing what Congress intended with these tax credits. Additionally, we'll have a 6th task force to examine related issues of temporary disaster tax relief. It will consider whether we should have a core set of permanent proposals so taxpayers who have suffered through devastating disasters, like the floods most recently in my home state of Iowa, don't have to wait for Congress to act before they can start rebuilding their lives, their small businesses, or their farms. We've asked the task forces to begin their work right away, and we expect them to complete their action by the end of June. This should provide adequate time to identify possible long-term solutions that can be enacted this year to end the annual extenders drama and provide certainty to taxpayers who utilize those provisions. We'll continue to work with the House of Representatives to resolve the situation with respect to the 2018 temporary policies and to provide relief for all those affected by the disasters of 2018 and so far this year. But we shouldn't wait any longer to start laying the groundwork to deal with all of these temporary tax policies as permanently as possible.